So we want to thank you for coming out to Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Marshall Shepard, the outgoing president of the American Meteorological Society, or the AMS, and it is my honor to host you here in my hometown. We have actually been planning this meeting for almost 2 years now, and we set a theme for the meeting as extreme weather, climate, and the built environment, new perspectives, opportunities, and tools. And when I wrote the summary and thinking about what I wanted to focus on as a theme at the Atlanta meeting, I was looking at the extreme weather and climate events that were impacting the United States and the globe in 2011 and 2012 timeframe. But lo and behold, Mother Nature wrote the prologue for this meeting last week in Atlanta. Certainly you heard about our extreme weather event, quote unquote, here in Atlanta, but I think it illustrates something that captures the essence of this particular meeting. We had a 1 to 2 inch snowfall in the Atlanta area, and to many of our northern counterparts that may not sound like extreme weather, but in a southern city that doesn't necessarily need to invest in infrastructure for snow removal and salt, coupled with 5 to 6 million people and transportation policy changes and whatnot, you have an interesting mix for what we saw last week. So the point in that statement is that we are in an era where it doesn't take the mega event to create havoc in society. Superstorm Sandy was barely a Category 1 hurricane, if you recall, and yet look at the damage that is done. So the notion of the juxtaposition of extreme weather, climate, and societal and society-based changes, I think those are the types of things that we want to think about within the context of this presidential forum and throughout sessions this week in Atlanta. I want to do a few housekeeping items before I turn over the rest of the presidential forum to Margaret Davison. First, I would like to thank the 2 program chairs for this meeting. This meeting that will be held this week have been planned by 2 of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Eileen Shea from NOAA. Could you stand, Eileen, and just wave your hand so people can see you? And Dr. Phil Ardenoy from Raytheon. These are our 2 program chairs. They've been awesome. I want to thank them in advance, and I'll be thanking them many times. I'd also like to recognize incoming President Dr. Bill Gale. I would also like to recognize the AMS and the AMS meeting staff. They're awesome. Many of you deal with them. As many of you that know me well, I'm a big fan of social media, so I invite you all to live tweet interesting things that you hear during the presidential forum. Use the hashtag AMS2014. There's good information out there. There are people that couldn't make this meeting. We want to share this information with them. You can follow the AMS at AMETSOC, or you can even follow me if you want at Dr. Shepard 2013 or Bill Gale. He's out there as well. Even though he says I got him in trouble because I tweeted people to follow him and he got 100 or so followers within 5 minutes. So the AMS is really engaged in social media, and I think it's a new format for us all. So thank you so much for coming to this plenary session. I am now going to turn this over to Dr. Margaret Davison from NOAA. She has been the mastermind of this particular presidential forum, along with Emily Wallace, who I want to make sure I acknowledge. She's been an essential part of the planning as well. And I'd also like to thank our overall program committee in general. So at this time, I would turn the podium over to Dr. Margaret Davison.
Thank you, Marshall. In addition to the events of the last week and the last few months, I think we all are aware that we live in an increasingly diverse natural, physical, cultural, and political world. And our challenges are not just understanding and advancing science, but effectively communicating it and using that to build a much more resilient community and world. The interconnectedness of our environment, with our built environment, with our economy, is increasingly complex as we roll forward. And so we're not able to discuss these issues each in their own little silo. And so today's panel represents to some degree some of that diversity, and I will explain it to you. But we're going to be exploring both the importance of communication and the importance of making these connections across the complexity. So first of all, the format. The format is somewhat like the McLaughlin group. So we're going to start off with a keynote speaker, a provocateur, as it were, and then we're going to engage in informed and hopefully interesting discussion for a period of time, and then we're going to open it up for you all to participate, not to ask questions of the panelists, but for you to contribute to the discussion that we have been having, because it is the goal of the AMS leadership that when we leave this meeting, that we all advance the common cause. We haven't just come to another meeting and had a great time, but we all actually have some new ideas, some new strategies, and some new tools that we can take away so that we can advance the important issues. So, with that, let me give you the playbill. Now, I realize that many of you are still hungover from last night, or at least those of you who are rooting for Seattle are still hungover. I'm going to guess that those of you who are rooting for the other team got to bed earlier than you thought you might. So, first up at bat, Andy Refkin. Well, I don't think Andy Refkin needs a lot of introduction, but some of you may know of him from his work as a science writer, editor for the New York Times. Others of you may be familiar with his award-winning .earth blog, also for the Times. And his work actually for the last 30 years. He's been one of the leading science and environmental writers in this country. He continues to do that at Pace University. And as you will see, he's also very talented in other ways. So I'm going to let him do a little more prep work for his opening remarks. And then I'm going to discuss, let me tell you who's the lineup is, going in order then. In no particular order. So, next up at bat is Peter Kariva. Next to Andy Refkin is Peter Kariva, who is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. Science-based conservation, I think the thing I most know Peter for is some of the great work he's done with Stanford and some other key partners to advance the construct of natural defenses, like that old Parquet commercial. Mother Nature always wins, and in fact, Mother Nature can still protect us sometimes much better and more effectively than we can, and certainly in some cases a little cheaper. And he's been with TNC for about a decade, having survived more than 20 years in the university and in the federal agency community. Next to him is David Titley. Briefly, he was my boss, somewhere between running the Navy's important issues on climate, and he was a great force when he was a Rear Admiral as the oceanographer and the navigator of the Navy, and he participated in many things, including leading the Navy's task force on climate change. He passed through NOAA for a moment, where he discovered that we don't actually salute so well at NOAA. And now he's a professor at practice at the Department of Meteorology at Penn State, which I assume is known to the AMS community. Next to him is David Perks, who is an architect and a professor at Mississippi State University, working out of Biloxi, where he runs the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio. And he's been actively engaged on a range of practical, affordable, and resilient housing issues, actually before Katrina, but I first noticed his work after Katrina, and he's also been participating in the Rebuild by Design efforts that are going on in the Northeast. So he focuses a lot on the intersection of landscapes and buildings and communities. Next to him, the master of disaster. So if you don't know Ellis, he chairs the board of the International Association of Emergency Managers, as well as the National Academy of Science Resilience Roundtable. He's been present for many major events over the last few decades, and he is currently the managing partner of Ellis Stanley Partners, LLC. I'm trying to see if he'll make me a partner one of these days soon. And last but certainly not least is my bookend, Leslie Chapman Henderson, President and CEO of FLASH, the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, which began more than 15 years ago as a small volunteer community group in Florida and has now grown into a great force and a leading voice for disaster resilience. throughout not just the South and the Southeast, but increasingly throughout the Midwest, where they seem to have forgotten the practice of having safe rooms. So with that, Andy, you're going to get this party started?
Okay. Thank you. So I'm just going to give brief, basically introductory points that we'll build on in a discussion. The question I have for you is this one: is the new communication climate good for the human-climate relationship? And what's interesting, of course, about our relationship to climate is that all through the history of our species, it was basically a one-way relationship. Climate did stuff, and we either moved or died, or reacted in some way, or put on clothing, or learned to use fire. And now combustion of fossil fuels and everything else has led to a two-way relationship with the climate system that's still in the early stages of our understanding. And I don't think we've fully grasped that. We're in the driver's seat on that and many other planetary knobs that Peter Kariva also knows about quite in some depth. The Anthropocene, if you want to call it that, is this era in which we've been plunked at the driver's seat of a car going about 60 miles an hour down a hill with the curves ahead, and it's getting foggy, and we didn't even, not only have we not read the driver's manual, but we don't know what that's all about. So that's an interesting position. Science has put us in that position, essentially. So we're in a race between our potency meaning our impact on the environment, our self-awareness, and how that plays out is really kind of, that's the issue at hand. And this relates to disaster risk as well, as you'll see. So there's three things changing at once. The environment is changing in a very rapid way. Our footprint is changing, meaning where we settle, what we do. And that's why, again, you can have a small event with very, very big consequences. And our communication norms are changing enormously. So I want to start with, by the way, the answer to the question is yes, with an asterisk. And the asterisk is about intentionality. If you dive into this morass of new ways to communicate, and you're not educated on how to think, how to react to those flows of information as a young person today, if you don't know where to sift to find out if something was not true or true, you know, when Philip Seymour Hoffman's death was out there, that was pretty quickly determined to be a true, sad fact, but stuff circulates now in a nanosecond. If you don't learn, the consumer of information has to be more engaged with the process. In the old days, it was so easy. The old days, I mean, I've been around forever. This is my 30 years of global warming and nuclear winter coverage started in 1985. So I've been around a long time. And then through this thing called a newspaper where you'd print stuff on the building of the New York Times used to rumble when the presses were getting going. And that's all so 20th century. So back then it was so easy. I think those of us who spent more than half of our lives in the 20th century, which is most of the people in this room, most of my students are the other way around. We deserve a group hug, so could you hug the person next to you and think about how it used to be?
This is my last broadcast as the anchor man of the CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is. Friday, March 6th, 1981.
So back in the old days, someone told us the way it is. We didn't have to actually think. We all had this communal, nightly macaroni and cheese, comfort food dinner of information given to us by avuncular people like Walter Cronkite. And now it's like this. So what's really weird is we're still all dining on comfort food, but everyone is now at a big buffet, and you're choosing the information source that you feel is reliable and that meshes with your own identity. So we've gone from having a communal sense of what's happening in the world to this kind of compartmentalized sense. And that's what I mean by the asterisk. Again, if we stay in our compartments and don't kind of examine why we think the way we think and why others think the way we think, then the internet cannot serve progress, I think, very well. So it's about figuring out ways to move forward amid all these realities is our challenge and opportunity. And by the way, all of this stuff, remember, this is just climate. This is like Climate Depot, climate blah, blah, blah. But all of that sits in the middle of a much bigger conversation, and those of us who spend so much of our time focused on climate and weather and reducing vulnerability to climate hazards and reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, we forget this is a really interesting website called newsmap.jp. And when you go there, you see what the world, you can do it by country or by the global, array. This is from last night. I didn't do an update this morning. But I kind of, if you can see there, hidden in there is this slide. So all of the Sturm und Drang, all this conversation, the debate we've had about global warming, that is all a tiny component of this. And I think we also have to give ourselves a group hug in the sense that we have to get used to the fact that, you know, these issues, however important we think they are still one of many things the world thinks about. And you can have your own discussion about what makes, you know, which of those things is actually important. And then, of course, you know, this is the downer side of my talk, and I'm going to quickly segue into the upside. There are the forces of division, people who want to divide the world, who feed on polarization. They know how to use this tool too. And they're not using it to make the world a better place most of the time, I think. And one of them was this guy. A few years ago, in 2009, I was on a panel about population and carbon and stuff, and a blog, a conservative blog, misinterpreted something I said, and then this happened in a flash.
This guy from the New York Times, if he really thinks that humanity is destroying the planet, humanity is destroying the climate, that human beings in their natural existence are going to cause the extinction of life on Earth, Andrew Revkin. Mr. Revkin, why don't you just go kill yourself and help the planet by dying?
I could think of more constructive things to do with a radio show. But, and he almost apologized. It took him about a week to sort of almost apologize. But it's amazing. So information, disinformation, non-constructive information can also move at the pace of electrons. And that can leave us all feeling sometimes like this cameraman at the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen. I took this picture there at the very end of that whole inconsequential set of discussions. But there's so many reasons to think about the exciting opportunities that are around us. It's really nice to hear about Marshall and Bill and everybody else getting engaged in these media, learning. You got to test drive things. You got to get. There are risks, the risks are among others having Rush Limbaugh suggesting you kill yourself. But the opportunities to engage in these conversations, to be a beacon for reality, to give consumers of information a place to go when something's happening that's concerning or confusing, are huge. And just here's one example from a completely different arena. Think about the role of a U.S. ambassador 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. It was to put on a gray suit and go to some functions and polish your shoes and hobnob over martinis. And now the U.S. ambassador to Nepal, one of his main interfaces with the Nepali people is Facebook. And he's very active in this role. And when I see things like this, I think it just is exciting evidence of the possibilities for engagement that come in these media. We bemoan the sort of the death of traditional media, although the New York Times still does matter. And it looks like with 800,000 paid subscribers online, we might actually have a future. But this Inside Climate News won a Pulitzer Prize a year ago for its enterprising coverage. It's a new nonprofit model for doing enterprising journalism. And it's kind of an active, aggressive, investigative approach. And I think that sent a big message around to the media, including the old media, that the playing field is asymmetrical. Anyone can have a meaningful role now, including students. The students I teach at Pace University, more and more of our courses are clinic style, where the students are actually working with nonprofit groups or with towns on issues like energy efficiency, that kind of thing. So it's just a great time. There are scientists who are finding new ways to break out, and there are journalists who are working with scientists sometimes to find new ways to convey the story of science. Here are a couple examples. Andy Bunn from Western Washington University, back in whenever I wrote this piece, 2008 or so, he said, "Hey, I'm going to Siberia and we're doing some really cool work there. Do you want to come?" See, that was the old model. A journalist with a pen and a pad would go into the field with scientists, and I've done plenty of that. But here, he was going. I didn't want to go to Siberia in the summertime. Anybody been there? Bugs, biting insects, costs. So I said, "You got cameras, you got audio equipment. You send me stuff. Send me a pile of audio and some pictures, and we'll create slideshow for the New York Times blog.earth, and we'll have some new kind of way to convey to the public what you're doing in the field, the process of science." And it was great, and it's become kind of a standing feature once in a while in .earth. They get their postcards from the field. And of course, Richard Alley has communicated in every possible way. including singing, and he does this fantastic Milankovitch cycle dance. I'm sure some of you have seen him. His bald spot is the North Pole, his nose is the equator, and he does all that funny stuff. And of course, he has tenure, so that makes it easier for him to do goofy stuff. The young scientists in the audience don't necessarily go there until you have tenure. And then there's just again, there's a really broad array of scientists who are getting engaged, climate scientists getting engaged on the web. You heard here about some, and there's Catherine Hayhoe, Richard Betts from the Met Office in the UK, Gavin Schmidt, and doing Google Hangouts. NASA has done some very creative work with Google Hangouts where they'll get together 4 or 5 people and discuss new findings in a paper, and it's just great to see that kind of engagement and experimentation, which can spill into classrooms and then offer insights to the next generation. So there's the hashtag. You heard about it a minute ago. The hashtag is such an amazing thing. And what it reminds me of is that we think about technological innovation or innovations in this age. We're usually thinking about a better photovoltaic panel or a better battery, but this was an invention. Chris Messina, who was working for Mozilla in way back in 2007, one day, for other programmers, had said this: how do you feel about using # for groups, as in # Barcamp? Barcamp is kind of a shorthand term for programmers. I have no idea what the origin is, but that was the proposal that led to the hashtag. Someone had the bright idea that a word with a little widget in front of it can be the core of a conversation that can be asynchronous, that anyone can latch onto at any time. And now there's so many fantastic conversations happening globally around these terms. AgChat, A-G-C-H-A-T, with # is the future of agriculture. WJChat, W-J-C-H-A-T, is web journalism. So people who are thinking about pushing the boundaries of how we communicate the news online are engaged in this 24/7 conversation around this thing that to me is kind of like Harry, the port key in a Harry Potter book, where you latch onto it and you go somewhere. It's just and it didn't require any investment. It was just a great idea. And of course, it's a way to cut through all of this. Most of what's on Twitter, unless you care about the Seahawks or Justin Bieber or whatever, is noise or feels like noise. But NASA, again, has done a great job of illustrating with its Asteroid Watch Twitter feed what's possible there. At Asteroid Watch now has 1 million followers. And remember what happened over Russia a year ago? Someday one of those is not just going to explode in the air overhead and shatter windows. It's going to be a really big event. And figuring out how to cut through the misinformation around these periodically when some astronomer sees something, the hype factor is high. So you create a place online like NASA has done. You create a sense of authority amid all the noise. So you can have variegated conversations, but you can cut through it in a heartbeat when you need to. Now I want to jump to some more general overarching points before we get to our conversation. There are ways to get beyond the shouting match that accompanies tough consequential issues like climate change. Decarbonizing a growing economy, especially in a world where about 3 billion people still don't have enough energy, not even remotely enough, don't really have enough fossil fuels in many places to have a reasonable life. That's consequential. It means there's always going to be fights, and labels are flying left and right these days. There are ways to get beyond that and to actually foster progress, even in this noisy environment. One is, of course, just knowing the terms of engagement. If you're going to get into a fight over a word like global warming, it's good to actually stop and listen and say, so what do you think this is? What are we talking about? And I did this slide a couple of years ago as a way to sort of articulate that there are different shapes to climate knowledge. There are things we know powerfully, and that even Michael Crichton agreed that that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. To me, you set that aside and say, okay, we can agree the world is warm, is the temperature it is largely because of greenhouse gases. So we're not arguing about that. More will make it warmer. But then you do realize that some of the most consequential aspects of global warming still are highly uncertain, and it's not manufactured uncertainty. So the shallow curves denote that for sea level rise in the next century, it's still very wide range. Hurricanes, the new IPCC report actually adds more complexity to what we think we know about hurricanes in a warming world, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think I use this slide just as a way to say, it's really good to start a conversation by knowing that everyone comes to that conversation with different sense of meanings of the words, and then you can have progress. Another place where there's plenty to agree on is that we have built extraordinarily vulnerable situations around the world where our growth spurt in the last 50 years, whether the risk is earthquakes or a tsunami or a climate risk like a tornado or a hurricane, we're just sitting ducks. And it's not because, as I said, many factors are changing, but in most of these places, the biggest factor is just where we're living. In both Typhoon Haiyan and in Moore, Oklahoma, the picture on the left is one of the parts of Moore, Oklahoma that was just devastated by the tornado. And on the right is the scene in Tabaclan in the Philippines. Both of those places had tripled populations in the last 40 years. So here in a developed country, we are building like crazy, as you'll hear from my friend at the far end of the line here, in ways that are not attuned to the risks there. In Haiyan, the people, people in coastal areas in developing countries, it's kind of a rush. There's very little governance. There's very little focus on structural strength. So Haiyan could have been a minor hurricane, a minor cyclone, and it would have had devastating impact as well. And we can agree, by the way, that there are subsidies here there are taxpayers are paying people still in this country to build in places where we know their houses will be destroyed. And so getting that message out is important. I think we were talking earlier about what that can lead to. Another thing some very interesting work that's been done for years now at Yale University, charting what Americans think about global warming and related issues. This survey, the 6 Americas survey, as you can see in the bubbles, each one of those bubbles is a portion of us. And they range from dismissive to alarmed. And the bubbles have kind of shrunk and grown over time. But what was interesting is when you ask people who have these divergent opinions, different questions, you see different responses. This data was from 2009, the run-up to the climate bill, the cap and trade bill. And when you ask people's support for cap and trade policy, even people who were alarmed about global warming were like, meh, my son's favorite term. They were sort of in the middle on whether that was even a good idea. And of course, the dismissives were off the charts, no. But here, look at this. So this is like you ask them a question about cap and trade. When you ask people support for providing rebates for purchases of solar panels and fuel-efficient vehicles, even the dismissives are at the midline. They're kind of saying maybe. So I say, you could have a conversation forever with that person about global warming, and it's not going to go anywhere if you know the social science data. But if you have a conversation about wise use of energy, it can go somewhere. Now the economists I talk to say, they look at this and they say, oh yeah, but Andy, that's just showing that people like to have free things. You give them something for free and they'll take it. But this slide, support for requiring, mandate, there isn't a word that's a more hot button word for my libertarian friends than a mandate. Requiring 45 miles per gallon fuel efficiency across vehicle fleets, even with a $1,000 premium to that. And even then, only the dismissives start to drift toward the negative space, and everyone else is still well above that midline. So again, there's ways to have a conversation that can go in the right direction on issues related to long-term risks from climate change, and that avoids just getting into this trap of just batting a ball back and forth forever. The attribution trap is something I think is worth thinking about, that when we all fight about how much of Hurricane X or Storm Y was a result of greenhouse forcing, it's non-productive, because this is still some of the earliest stage science that's being done is the attribution science. So it's highly uncertain. And so in trying to get the public's attention by saying, oh, this is part of what we expect in a global warming world, if you don't articulate the way you say that carefully, then you end up in this trap where those who don't want any change in our greenhouse gas menu can be empowered and say you're not being true to the facts. This was the great flood of 1927 in Vermont, and there's a longish story behind how this relates to this, but it was the flood of record for a study that this study here in 2002. This was a really important paper, which showed that when you look at lake bed sediment, you can see this record in the past of scouring floods going back in time, extreme events. And it shows that, well, the key line here is detected increases in contemporary storminess may not be a reliable indicator of human-induced climate change, because when you look with a longer lens, a longer time scale through this part of the Holocene, you see that there have been flooding, scouring events at greater frequency in millennia past. So this kind of, but we don't like, and the line at the top here was a line from a New York Times newsroom conversation about an unrelated issue, where it was, I was working on the team studying the crash of Flight 800 in 1996 off of Long Island, and everyone assumed it was a terrorist thing for the longest period of time. The first couple of months, we just knew there had to have been a bomb or missile. And then increasingly, the data were showing us it wasn't a bomb or a missile. It was one of these stray, weird electromechanical issues. But an editor said, we don't want to step on our own story. And that was a haunting thing. And it actually got the paper, we lost a Pulitzer Prize, I think, because we kind of overdrove the terrorism meme. So staying true to the data, even with our own predispositions, can be really hard. I'm going to jump ahead because I don't want to eat it too much into our time. There's so many opportunities to use the web as an education tool. It's match.com, not just for girls and boys, or boys and boys, or girls and girls, but it's for stuff, for ideas. Just think about setting up a portal where you have busy science teacher needs X, and one thing they need is little videos. And then it turns out there's a science teacher in Montana, Paul Anderson, who has been creating videos explaining simple science concepts, and he's become kind of this virally popular source of great information. And that just shows you there's so many other examples of this kind of thing, where we can move the ball forward amid all the noise factor and create beautiful outcomes. And visualizations are really important. Adam Neiman in England and others. I love this one. This is the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure. He's done this for the ocean, the water and everything. So I could tell you the volume of the atmosphere, but if I show it to you as a starting point for a conversation on a global commons issue, I think it's a better way to go. And then some of you have seen this, I'm sure.
The mistake when interpreting statistics is to look at them from too short a distance. This can make everything unclear and confusing. So forget the details and take a step back. You're looking at a dog when you should be concentrating on the owner. As you can see, the dog is all over the place, leaping and bouncing, sometimes upwards, sometimes downwards. But where do you think it'll be in 10 seconds' time? Around here, right? But at this moment, the dog is on its way downwards, so why do you think it'll find itself up there? It's because you've noticed the owner. The owner is the trend, and it's he who determines where they both will be in a while, as a bit longer than a couple of dog bounds. He could change direction. There's a lot we don't know about this guy, but everything we do know indicates he's heading in that direction. The owner is the long-term trend. The dog is the variation around this trend. Or, the owner is the climate, the dog is the weather.
So, simple, gets the point across. Very creative little entity. So, I talk about being a multimedia, the importance of multimedia. I'm also a songwriter, and I've been a performer for a long time. And so I'm going to close my talk with a song I wrote in about 1996 about the floods in Colorado in 1995. There was a spring flooding event there, June of 1995. My wife was living in Boulder at the time, so working with people at NOAA. All right, hold on a second. Let's see if this works. It was June up in the Rockies. The sun was beating down. Deep snow fields were melting fast. The creeks ran wild and brown. Streams all joined together in a once-in-a-lifetime roar. No problem, said the engineers. Dams can handle more. Meanwhile, way down in the tourist towns, like always, life was good. Some merchants printed t-shirts saying, I survived the flood. But a thunderstorm was building like no one could recall. Black anvil clouds, they rose so high. They made those Rockies small. Seems like nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. wind howled like a wounded wolf. Niagara Falls, it rained. High in the thundering canyons, the dams began to strain. Those engineers were sweating as they pound computers' keys. Their worst case calculations look like reality. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. People building condos and driving 4x4s, playing golf on perfect greens and shopping fancy stores. They never knew what hit them until it was too late. A freight train wall of water, it wiped clean their whole slate. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. The storm rolled east all through the night. Flood waters ebbed away. As first light hit the Rockies, the townsfolk were amazed. Those mountains gleam like silver, malls and condos gone. The people smiled, some embraced. The world did look newborn. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Well, don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Recognizing both Pete Seeger and Gilbert White, we should dedicate this discussion to both of them, yes? Yes, so Peter, you're sitting next to Andy. You have some remarks that you'd like to start off with, either picking up on Andy's theme of use every tool you have and maybe a few you don't even know you yet have, or your contribution.
Well, I think we could all be inspired by Andy's singing, and I've been a research scientist and an environmentalist since the Spotted Owl trials in the Great Northwest. Go Hawks, by the way. But the one thing that I've learned is probably most of us in the room have had some science communication training. You know, you get the message box, you're told not to use jargon, but it's more than that. It's connecting to people. And I mean, that's what you're doing there. I mean, you connect to people. So when we talk about climate and weather, it's talking about when you plant the corn, you know, where's your favorite fishing? Where'd you used to surf? That's connecting to people. That's something we're all introverts, and it's very, very hard for us to do. Luckily, some of these media and technology helps us connect to people and be introverts. So we could take refuge in that. The other thing that I pick up from listening to Andy talk is, you look at that, you look at our building and where we're building things in this environment. And in the US, planning is a bad word. Planning is a bad word because planning is something that's done to you. And we don't like having things done to us. But if planning becomes a community action and more an engagement, it's part of the cultural shift from the Walter Cronkite. People used to tell us the way it was. You can't tell anybody. You can't give people information and tell them. They have to be part of the conversation. I think we can shift the planning sort of hurdle by shifting it from planning to sort of community visioning. So that's what I take from Andy's.
Okay. Admiral?
Thanks, Mark. You know, listening to Andy and thinking about how I've tried to talk about climate, and weather, and you're talking to a bunch of old retired admirals, and it's like, okay, this may not be the easiest audience then to start with, but that's good. And and I think what Andy kind of showed here is, I just sort of take it up to a little bit larger level, is be yourself. It may not be, I will do you guys a great favor by not singing, because Marshall still wants to have people here for the rest of his meeting. But there's going to be something that works. I found that, putting things like in military terms, if I'm talking to military guys, works pretty well. Put things in personal terms. We all have stories. If you look at my TEDx video, it starts with a rain gauge that I bought when I was 10 years old. And that started the story. It wasn't like some graph of an IPCC reporter, something god awful like that. It was something much more personal. And then be able to put this stuff in English. So like when I talk about climate change, I talk about it's people, it's not polar bears. Sorry, TNC. It's all about the water. Too much, too little, wrong place, wrong time. Salty where you thought it was going to be fresh, liquid where you thought it was going to be frozen. And it's the change. It's like, I get so many people, it's like, well, the climate's changed, including like congressmen. The climate's changed before, it'll change again. You're absolutely right. But we've had this 8,000 period of wonderful stability. Oh, by the way, that's when we built human civilization. And now we're going to change it. And as Andy mentioned, we're going to change it not just for the climate scientists, but we're going to change it for 7+ billion people, with the water, with the food, with the energy, which then becomes a security issue if we don't get this right. So can we adapt and mitigate faster than the natural environment's going to change? And if we don't, it's not just an environmental issue, it is the issue. I'll stop there. Thanks.
David?
I think one of the challenges for all of us is to connect our sort of local actions with the sort of larger community, larger global action. And I find, I do a lot of work in communities, and I find that when you come in and talk about sort of stormwater, for example, people relate to that because they say, yeah, our street floods more than it used to. And you begin talking and realizing that when people talk about things locally, and you begin to then take that conversation up to the kind of bigger picture. So I think in many ways, the kind of connection, I think, that we're talking about here, in many ways is sort of right there in front of us. It could be the connection within our own neighborhood, to begin within our own local school, to help link between some of the local issues and how they begin to help us think of these larger issues. One of the things that I'm always really encouraged when I go into, we do a lot of work with school kids and teach them about environmental science, and I'm always so encouraged that kids get it. I mean, there's a way that our kids are getting, in a sense, a kind of dosage of, from Nickelodeon, whatever, the kind of dosage of seeing the world in a way that's more around these issues. So you walk into a classroom and they say, is this about the environment? And kids jump into it. And so I think that there's a lot of encouragement that on the level of communities, the conversation is there, and I think the challenge for all of us that work at various scales is to bring that up. And I think the notion of planning, I mean, this is essentially what I do a lot of, and the kind of planning is one of these areas where I think the conversation is I think, encouragement beginning to shift a bit. The planning, and this is something that is changing in the last really several years. Planning is beginning to get a different kind of time horizon, and it's good to begin to get into the process of thinking about our communities with a different sort of time horizon, and begin to say we are in a adaptive planning mode here, realizing that our future is different than our present, and so planning is beginning to, I think, get the notion that we have to imagine a different future, and how do we then adapt to that. So I think on the level of community conversations, there's a lot of positive places to start from. And I think the challenge for all of us is figure out how to keep that moving forward.
Andy, I was taken immediately to something that happened to me yesterday while I was waiting for Super Bowl. I went into this bookstore and I asked the clerk, where's the self-help section? And he looked very sternly at me and said, if I tell you that, it'll kind of defeat the purpose, won't it? And I think what that's saying is we still have a responsibility as individuals. We have that role that we must assume ourselves, we do have a vast array of opportunities to get messages and information and be able to apply it to our own activities. Another thing you talked about relative to how we are receiving this message and being able to discern it. At the local level, we know all politics is local, and I've been seeing the folks people have been electing here, people that said things like, we don't need the National Weather Service, we got the Weather Channel, that type of stuff. And then you got the other side of where people are making germane statements based on conversations that they've had with the talent, with the people that know, and they have started bridging the gap. So I was really intrigued, and my hashtag from this meeting is great opportunity.
So in our work, the bottom line is we don't think there's any greener or better structure than the one that doesn't end up in the landfill after the disaster. And for 15 years, our best partners in trying to convey this message are those in the weather community, because you are beloved and people love weather. But when we align the empowering messages of how to make a difference and debunk the myths, you can build an affordable, resilient structure. And you can do so with nature in mind and be sensitive to that. And when we take weather and that message and put it together, it's a winning combo. So, 10, 12 years ago, we joined forces with Disney, greatest storytellers in the land. And people laughed at us and said, that's a very serious topic. And I think you demean it by even considering bringing a story into Disney World. And we said, if we don't get the story to people, it's just going to live in the lab. So in 2008, we opened an experience at Epcot, and I'm not supposed to tell you how many, but I will tell you that more than 4 million have been there. Our partners in the weather and climate and engineering and other communities helped us build it. It's edutainment, it's what Andy just did. We educate, we entertain, but most importantly, we empower people. We give them specific, simple information that helps them understand, oh yes, you can. You can build a house or a building to withstand Mother Nature, and as a result, you will create a resilient family or workforce or community as a byproduct. And this is a model that now is being taken out there. I think being on this panel today is exciting to me because I think every one of you, and we talked this morning, I think Marshall and Bill asked us, what do we want from you? I want every one of you to know that you can leave here and make a difference, just in myth busting about resilient structures, or just go home and find out, the simplest thing. Do you have a building code? Does it have a model year? Is it enforced? And ask those questions and you'll be very surprised at the answers. Please don't assume that we automatically build in a way that confronts Mother Nature and respects it, because we're not there yet. But the good news is we can get there.
Well, we can enact good building codes, but can we actually enforce them is always the second part of the challenge.
And I think that we assume that that's already happening. I think in our dialogue, we worked in more after the tornadoes, and remember, we're really good at prevention after the bad things happen. So we go after Katrina or after Andrew when we were formed, or after Moore or after an earthquake. And I was on a group last week talking in New York about people's assumptions that it's only in the unincorporated areas and maybe in the countryside that building codes aren't there. And I'm here to tell you that the city of New York does not enforce their building code. It's a voluntary system. And if it's voluntary, it's not going to happen.
So each of you in your work, have you seen a great example of how weather and climate resilience has been incorporated into community planning, infrastructure planning, or building codes, or emergency planning? Do you actually have a great example? Ellis?
San Francisco, the Bay Area, they've done a tremendous job. And one of the reasons that San Francisco has been so successful is they have a mayor there that can wax eloquently for 45 minutes on the resiliency and mitigation and disasters. This mayor came up through government. He's not a lifelong politician, but he's suffered through disasters in his community. They know California has done reports that says by the year 2100, the sea level of the Pacific will rise 55 inches. That's of direct import to them. And they've gathered the community, they've started collaboration, and they're doing proactive things to address that right now.
David?
I certainly can share something that's currently going on that I think for many of you should pay attention to, because I think it's going to set, I think, a good direction in this area. Some of you, in fact, it was mentioned that we're working on a program called Rebuild by Design, and just give you just a little background, something to watch for. So HUD then, essentially back in the summer, put out a call for design teams to come up with innovative ideas around resiliency in the Northeast. And so there are 10 teams that were selected that are working. In fact, we're all working hard because we're kind of right. We have a midterm presentation, in fact, this week. Each of the 10 teams are going to be presenting this week. But the thing that I found really encouraging, and for me, kind of having worked after Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast for quite a while, that we are in a different time. And it's very encouraging that the conversation around the sort of planning work is not about how do we sort of build back the way we had it, but how do we do things differently. And so watch for this HUD-sponsored Rebuild by Design. There's 10 communities that are our team is a Gulf Coast team working in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it's one of the things that I think is really positive is to see how communities are much more engaged in looking at their vulnerabilities, as you know, one of the challenges is much of our infrastructure is in harm's way for practical reasons. For example, all waste treatment plants are downstream, right? So it puts all of our cities' waste treatment plants in flood areas because they're downstream. Most of our old cities have combined sanitary and storm sewer systems. So people are now seeing these systems in a way that is much more attuned to their vulnerability and really beginning to say, okay, we can't keep doing things the way we've done in the past. And so, in fact, the little drawing of the dog and the owner, I see that diagram for me. It's like when we have some sort of event like Hurricane Sandy, it gives us this kind of peak in the kind of awareness of our risk. As risk continues in a kind of steady line, we have these events that peak the awareness, and it's in that opportunity that I think we all need to find how to work well. How do you work well in that time of increased awareness to get a community to sort of see things differently and to begin to imagine a future that has a different sort of set of risks than the current, and how do we begin to adapt to that? So again, kind of watch for this Rebuild by Design planning work, because I think in many ways the intention is for it to begin to set some good example of how communities can plan for a time horizon that is 50 years down the road instead of just dealing with things in the present tense.
So you mentioned planning a longer planning horizon. So Admiral, you mentioned how you used to operate in a very traditional environment, and you were a very important part of leading the Navy to lean forward on these issues, both domestically as well as internationally. Can you talk a little bit about how that transformation occurred during your tenure as the leading advocate within a fairly traditional group?
Sure. I mean, one thing I'll have to say here is leadership counts. I mean, ultimately, this comes down to people. It's not technology, it's not a graph, but it's people. At the time, the head of the Navy, the uniformed head of the Navy, was a gentleman named Admiral Gary Roughhead, and he was concerned about the Arctic. And he was like, hey, I don't know where this is going, but I really do want the facts because I'm just getting a lot of noise. And he was quite happy to have the facts lead us where they should. So having a boss like that really engendered success. So I would say that the leadership counts. So getting for the wider perspective, it's how do you, in fact, at various levels, be it the mayor, be it the city manager, it doesn't have to be the governor, it doesn't have to be the senior person in the whole government, but at whatever your part of the organization is, having sort of that upper level to at least be open to looking at this is really useful. And I think that that as much as anything allowed us to do that. And then we really stayed on the facts. We found that once we got to the point where we could have a discussion, again, I could use like military analogies. I happen to be a navigator. Probably 2/3 of the people in this audience don't even know that there was a time where we did not have global positioning system. And navigation did not mean just look at your smartphone and it would tell you exactly to within 15 centimeters of where you are in the world. But you actually, believe it or not, you had to look at the stars and the sextant, and you look at a lot of different information. And most professionals in the Navy, they could understand that analogy. So then we start going down some of the climate. So okay, we can look at air temperature, but maybe you can argue about that. But then let's look at water temperature, sea level rise, glaciers. I mean, you guys know the drill. And you put that all together, you say, well, okay, if the climate's not changing, what's your explanation? Okay, and if it's all natural, then just tell me when it's going to stop, and that'll be great, and then we can stop this. Oh, you can't do that. So okay, so let's then plan for at least a linear, and you can look at a trend. Maybe there's a little more, and you just sort of talk about it like that. As I said, it's people. Somebody mentioned it's local. I find the further away you get from Washington, D.C., the easier it is to have this conversation. Having testified before the House Science Committee last month, I think the last place that will understand climate change is actually at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But that's okay, because they will respond to what we find, and we will have to lead the Congress. It's not going to be the other way around. I'll just stop there.
So Peter, we've talked a little bit about the built environment, the planned environment. How do we begin to connect the natural environment with the rest of the landscape? Or actually, how do we begin to connect the human built environment with the landscape? You've really been leading on some of those discussions. Do you see how we can take lessons from ecosystem-based management, ecology, and natural defenses and advance that as part of our planning toolkit?
So we don't use ecosystem-based management because that's one of those phrases that turns off communities, but we use natural defenses. That resonates. Right. And I think
you got that from focus groups, right?
Yes, we did get it from focus groups in Louisiana. And natural defenses is something everybody has some connection to because we know ideas about take shelter from a storm. Go to the high ground. Where's the flood going to come? Where's the flash flood? So there's some basic connection to the natural landscape being varied in how it shelters you from events. We build on that, and I think in Andy's presentation he mentioned visualization tools. Combining visualization tools that show you what marshes and oysters can do for you in these events. You don't need any numbers whatsoever. You don't need any numbers whatsoever. You just use the visualization tools and the innate understanding of it, and communities connect to it, and the science is pretty solid here. As long as we don't overstate it, it's never going to be purely a natural solution. It's always going to be a hybrid. But the point is that natural defenses can contribute a lot, and they bring a lot of other benefits. And I see successes in the Gulf, in New York, in Connecticut, in California, and I think it's almost just a limit in us scaling up.
Right. So we all, I think, agree that inside DC, the conversation's highly polarized for a lot of different reasons. But as you move out on the landscape and you begin to connect it to people and their issues, I often say it's like golf. You got to play it where it lies, right? But who all do we need to begin including in this conversation? Who's not a part of this conversation that could help advance it? Are there opportunities through groups or organizations or communities or subsets of communities? I mean, for instance, I noticed that after Katrina, the Vietnamese community was one of the first to rebound because they already had their kinship and social networks very intact. And they were already into self-help, so in South Louisiana, they were among the quickest to recover their footing. But how do we begin to advance this concept across the landscape where we're not necessarily so homogeneous in one small community?
I'd say faith-based communities. Almost. I mean, faith-based communities are important in our education systems. They're important culturally, and even globally, they're hugely important. And as scientists, you know, we may have had a reluctance to engage with them, but they're natural allies.
Yes.
Well, schools, I think schools could be a model for resilience. And also, too many parts of the world, schools are a place you still have to run away from in a disaster instead of run to.
Yes.
So making them hubs for smart design, whether it's, and also for sanitation and so many other things. You have so much that, and people care about their kids. And also when students learn to, my wife used to teach us science, she was a science teacher, they used to do this exercise. A lot of kids build a bridge and you break it, you put a weight on it until, but they added a cost-benefit component to it. And she and her co-teacher, you bought your wood with money, but you were judged. Your quality of your design was not just what much weight it could withstand, but your costs and benefits. So, getting us all attuned to the realities that we face. No one can live a perfectly safe life, but thinking resiliently, learning about resilience in the way we teaching it is important, I think, too.
So, Ellis, this is actually your wheelhouse.
Well, it could be. I've been successful in operating with an African proverb that says, it's not about us without us. It's not about us without us. And it's probably an easier question to ask who shouldn't be at the table. Because when you start that conversation, you do want to make sure that the faith-based, because that's another organization that connects to the community, the schools, the universities, the public in general, the philanthropic organizations, these foundations that have to decide where they want to focus their energy at the beginning of each year. They should probably be part of that conversation. Resilience is a bottom-up to be successful. It has to start at the bottom and move up. But it's important that the decisions be science-based, that you provide economic incentives, and you look at it from those perspectives.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the economic incentives, but first I want to point out that there are actually microphones about midway across the room, and if some of you would like to contribute to the dialogue, you can start moving towards the microphones, because I'm going to ask these guys one last question here, and then I'm going to look and see if I can see beyond the keg lights and find someone and a microphone. So, Leslie, yes, you have a comment.
I have another opportunity for everybody here to help this cause. There is a new bit of legislation in Congress called the Disaster Savings Account Act of 2014. And like a health savings account, it will allow for $5,000 a year preferential tax treatment. It's a very bipartisan supported novel concept of rewarding through preferential tax treatment those who live in harm's way, which includes all of us, for whatever measures they take to strengthen, fortify, or otherwise retrofit an existing home, or on the new construction side, do something differently. And it could even just be to protect themselves from power outage, because that's become something we've all come to recognize and appreciate how much damage can be done there. The act will also allow those once affected to accelerate contributions and rebuild better. This is our greatest challenge in resilience, is our financial and insurance system puts us back the same way we started. And what we need to gain, get a leg up on resiliency is to stop and break that cycle. We need to build back better. So across the board, we need to look at everything that gets in the way. And one of those things is that little bit of extra money to upgrade to a more resilient structure. It's the Ross-Inhofe Act, and it's gaining ground. James Lee Witt is supporting it. And I think it's something that we can all get behind, because it will help people make a difference and, again, empower them to take charge. The other thing I was going to talk about, I'm going to actually ask David to talk about, because you're talking about the faith-based communities and the volunteer communities, and what an engine of importance they are in recovery and prevention mode. And I think in this movement we have to allow for serendipity. And as it turns out, the affordable housing universe that serves the low-income, uninsured, and underinsured is the group that is going to demonstrate for us the affordability of mitigation and resilience. And David and I are partnered on a project along those lines.
In fact, there's a Resilient Neighbors Network that has grown up. It's actually Flash was the inspiration for it in a number of communities, and it's actually these coalitions of the willing, community-based coalitions of the willing, who are now coming together and sharing their stories and their lessons with each other. So I think that's really important. Marshall, I'm actually not a PhD. I'm a recovering lawyer, and one of the things I'm always interested in is how do we actually make this possible? And I also live on the coast at 5.5 feet. So I think one of the other tools that I've discussed with lawyers recently that I think I'm going to make my own special advocacy platform is there's something that I think we can do without legislation under the generally accepted accounting principles, which guides HR Block and everybody's preferred tax provider. In this country right now, you amortize or depreciate the built environment, but you don't amortize the underlying real estate because the historical presumption is that it would always be there. Now, where I live in Charleston and some places like South Florida, I think there might be actually a physical basis for setting up a system in which we could begin to amortize the underlying real estate so that people could begin to get some tax savings. Plus, it would provide a little bit of a psychological shift, right? So we're very used to in-holdings. It's a concept of a piece of property that you have in a national forest or a national park, and you have a life estate on it, but it's not something you would pass in your testamentary trust. So if we could begin to amortize the underlying real estate in coastal areas that are faced with a water level situation, perhaps we could actually help some of those people to think about how they might have a different alternative future in mind as well. So with that, I think I actually see people out there. So the guy standing closest to me, please, what is your name and rank and serial number, and what is your contribution to the discussion?
I was going to try to tell you my barcode, less the serial number, but I don't know if I can convey, the different strips of thin and thick black stripes. My name's Tom Bedard. I'm a graduating senior from Penn State.
And could you speak up a little bit? Because I can't hear you.
I wanted to avoid the failure of getting too close to the mic and blowing everybody's ears out at the same time. So my comment was resilience should be a function of disaster risk reduction, which was intended, when it started, to be a bottom-up grassroots approach and not this administrative top-down kind of look at things. In my experience living on the Gulf Coast, I found that code was kind of looked at as the government policy telling us how to build our houses and how we should live our life. What do you guys think about taking this approach from, instead of creating more policy, to getting out into the community and getting a feel for the actual decision makers, which are men and women, less emergency managers, community planners, administrators, and more your neighbors?
Leslie, Ellis, David?
I'll start. The building code, it's going to have to be a system, but the building code is the minimum standard for a safe structure. And I think people frequently misunderstand it's not an ideal. And I think it is government's role to set the minimum standard for safety so that a house has a crumple zone and an earthquake zone, or it has the ability to withstand surge. But you're right, we also need incentives, either through insurance, tax, or other means, to let the owners take charge and drive and empower their resilience.
I want to just jump into something real quick. I think one of the very important challenges in front of all of us here today is we are, I feel, at a very ripe spot in this conversation. And just, it wasn't that long ago that you'd had a bunch of people together and we would have talking about, say, words like sustainability and green and energy efficient. And what happened, and you all know this, what happened is much of the kind of conversation around sustainability has become a kind of polarized conversation, right? And so in a very, I think, promising way, I find that the word resiliency sort of touches both people's local kind of day-to-day worries about their own house, and it helps them kind of step back and look at the bigger system. So in answer to your question, I actually think the only way we're going to kind of come out of this and not kind of lose the effectiveness of this work because it becomes politicized, because people see it as being somehow, some kind of government control, right? I think it's got to work kind of from the bottom and from the top. There's got to be, kind of conversations at both levels, so that it doesn't then so the people kind of locally don't feel like somehow this is just another kind of set of regulations. So I think it's going to have to work both directions. Otherwise, it will run the kind of course of other kind of efforts to then begin to get resistance on the community because they see it as being too much about regulation.
One of the things that we have, when I was working with the National Academy of Science to do a country, and I did some international things on what resilience looked like and why it was successful. And it wasn't successful because of bureaucrats pulling a meeting together. The planning is all important, but the process of that is probably what the takeaway should be. Getting everybody in the room, understanding. We do a lot. We do pretty good in translating language in this country. We do a poor job on translating culture and how these communities, what they need to sustain themselves, etc. is very important. And we have to listen. And we did a lot of listening sessions around the country. We did a lot of things that the people are the ones that's going to make the difference at the end of the day. Bureaucrats are going to retire. Bureaucrats are going to die. It's the community that's going to be the vibrant aspect of that. We saw that the cultural aspect of, in Chile, for example, they learned at an early age, if the ground shakes hard enough to knock you off your feet, go to higher ground. The government's warning system didn't work first, and then it had incorrect information secondly. No one died in that community that lived there because they went to higher ground. That's what's going to start that change, is that cultural revolution, that resiliency revolution, if you will, that's going to make the difference as we move forward.
Okay. Andy?
Could I, the best way, I think a good starting place in this idea of how, at that level, how you influence decisions, it's all money. A good starting place is to look at where there are pernicious subsidies or incentives that are prompting people to invest in harm's way. Headwaters Economics did a really good study about the red zone in Colorado, fire zones, and they have a 10-point plan for how to sort of at least get a handle on overbuilding in places like that. One is, why do we still give a federal tax deduction for a second mortgage for a house that's built in a red zone, in a place where we know there's a high fire risk? Why is that? Why are our taxes supporting that? So start at least to whittle away those incentives. And politically, they're hard because you saw what's already happening with flood insurance. Basically, people were actually maybe going to have to pay the cost, the actual risk of living in a flood zone. But now it's like, no, it should be cheap again.
I got 5 years to sell my house.
So there's political resistance, but looking for ways to do that, I think, is an important starting place.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, people respond, and I think it's kind of actually what Andy said a lot, is people respond to incentives. So if you align incentives to have better building, because otherwise you can't get insurance or you can't afford it, that's helpful. Ultimately, we should look at where we're building. And I say that having lived in Waveland, Mississippi for 7 years, 2 houses off Beach Boulevard, if you know where that is. If you want to buy my lot, come see me afterwards, because it doesn't have a house anymore. But the incentives for people were not to change their behavior, by and large. So they didn't. So we will, not may, we will go through that again. I told people on the Gulf Coast, they all said, oh my God, it's never going to happen, never happened before. I said, this is not a once in a X hundred years event. This is a once in a mortgage event.
Yes.
And our human memory, there's tons of studies that show this with climate, that, people think of what climate was what was it like yesterday. It's the same with remembering this sort of thing. Our time frame is so very short that we don't integrate over the long time. So we have to design incentives that will help people do that, because our brains just aren't going to do it by ourselves.
even God didn't keep St. Santa Claus from having to be rebuilt after Camille and Katrina.
And again, and again,
Yes.
and again.
So the person at the second microphone in the back with a light blue shirt.
Yeah, I'm Ahmed Tawfik, a postdoctoral fellow at George Mason University. And I just kind of wanted to comment on something and then maybe get your take in the form of a question at the end also. So the way I've kind of seen it play out is that, or at least, in my anecdotal life, is that there's always two components, and one of those components is the messenger, and then you got the message. So no matter what Andy says, some people are not going to believe anything that comes out of his mouth, and they're going to demonize him. And similarly, you can think about it from the other side. So anything that comes out of Anthony Watts' mouth, for example, nobody's going to care about, and they're going to dismiss him immediately. So it doesn't matter what you say sometimes, but they're just not going to listen to you. Those are some people. There are other people who look at the message and then say, maybe, maybe not. But you can easily pollute that message and bring it back to the messenger and tie those two together. So for example, the way I see it is you have political language, talking points that are being used. As Andy also illustrated, when you say words like cap and trade, that is a political term, that is a policy term. So those individuals who are more libertarian-minded hear that, immediately alarm bells go off, and they may even eventually, if you do that enough, label Andy as this political group, I'm of this political group, I'm no longer listening to Andy. So it's kind of like you can reverse poison the well and tell the messenger he's wrong by the messaging, the words, the specific words that you're using that highlight certain things in people's mind. I think everybody on the panel kind of touched on that, saying, well, I shouldn't use talking points specifically. And maybe what's lacking is also a credibility issue that ends up happening to science in general, in that if we use political terms long enough, we end up demonizing sort of scientists, so that scientists become these people who are trying to install political change rather than people who are trying to find information out. And so I feel like that there's this kind of back and forth that happens between messenger and message that can easily get polluted. And I'm wondering if we can't go back to another model that has happened, at least for scientists, maybe not for science writers, but maybe for scientists, in the sense that we can go back to something a little bit more inspirationally based, kind of like a Carl Sagan approach, which was to inspire people with the sort of the elegance, the interesting things in science, and then you become a credible messenger, essentially, in the end, who can then tell people, okay, he's an inspirational guy, this is an inspirational person, maybe we can have something interesting that we can learn from them, rather than it being an ends, which oftentimes it is, about home safety and environment, which I'm sure, of course, there's people on the panel who operate exclusively in the actionable world, but I'm speaking, I guess, more towards the science and messaging portion, if that makes any sense.
Anyone want to comment? Yes. Yes.
Well, one thing I've learned in 30 years of this stuff is scientists and journalists and everybody else are a variegated lot, and there'll be no single norm for how to communicate that will be appropriate for everybody. And you see that, in fact, in my longer presentation, I have a picture of Jim Hansen in handcuffs and Susan Solomon from 2007 when she led the IPCC rollout in Paris. At that Paris rollout, a journalist, a BBC reporter, was trying to get her not just to state the facts of Working Group 1, but how does it make you feel? You could see him kind of badgering her to be a human being. And she literally was like this, no, that's not my job. And Hansen, of course, and others have a much more different approach. And there's room for everything, there's room for all of those approaches. So we have to get used to the reality that we live in a variegated landscape to some extent. I do encourage people, including journalists, to speak in two sentences. I'm a scientist, I study sea ice. I'm a parent, and I'm worried about my kid's future. Then you can at least compartmentalize. You're not sort of implying a faux kind of authority on cap and trade legislation because of your science.
Peter?
I think there was also a hint of an answer to your question in Andy's slide about where you were talking about, it was a blue slide, you had the different messages about climate change. I think you could do a handoff between the scientist and somebody else, and then that person becomes the messenger. And I'll tell a story. We work with Dow Chemical in Freeport, Texas. When we went into Freeport, Texas, and we were working with them on natural defenses for coastal areas, we were advised not to talk about climate change because they don't believe in climate change there. We didn't talk about climate change, but we worked on solving their flood and storm and drought problems just as scientists. We then never had to be the messenger. We talked about the issues that they cared about. Then they became the messenger within their culture. And so that's sort of like a handoff. So you work on the problems that are at hand, the material problems are at hand, and then within that community, they become the messengers.
What we just heard described is if you can't get them for murder, get them for tax evasion. And it's very, very effective. You look at how the Department of Defense and the Navy has talked about all its energy, conservation, non-carbon based sources. Most of us in here would say, hey, that's a great mitigation strategy for climate change. That was never mentioned intentionally. We talked about it in terms of security, we talked about it in terms of tactical flexibility, we talked about it in terms that it would resonate. Oh, by the way, if some of these things pan out, they could be part of the solution on how to change some of our energy systems. So kind of part of this is the messenger. So I was an active duty admiral. That kind of sets you up with a set of people. And then if you can, again, in a factual kind of plain English way and with pictures, talk about these issues, that can be useful. And it's state who you are, know yourself, be comfortable with yourself, stick with yourself, and everybody in this room has credibility with some group in there.
I've observed that we are a siloed nation. We're siloed. Universities are one of the most siloed systems on earth. And that's not a bad thing. There's lots of good things go on within those silos. And I think the opportunity here is to link the silos. The hard sciences ought to be talking with the social sciences. We do brand the messenger in this country as opposed to the message. Imagine if you start that dialogue among the different agencies, talking with emergency management, because when we even talk about climate change, one of the things that's going to happen from an emergency management perspective is we're going to start operating more in an emergency management state or mode. And anytime we're operating in that, we usually do things out of haste, incorrectly, and more costly. So if we start that dialogue among all the different silos, I think we can come up with a message that everybody has buy-in on, and that's going to play a little better.
And last audience person, a woman at the front mic.
Hi, I'm Coral Arroyo from Florida State University. I'm an undergraduate, and on top of my degree, I'm working on a certificate in emergency management. And Andy, you said we live in vulnerable areas in terms of hazards, and I read a book by Ted Steinberg, I think Acts of God, Unnatural History of Natural Disasters in the United States. And he touches on this a lot. He mentions the history of the city of Charleston, a floodplain area somewhere within the Mississippi River in Missouri, somewhere with the Mark Twain house history. Being in Florida, obviously, a lot of the area is low level. How do you get these people to understand the risks? Like the history of Southern Florida is that, and even California, Mr. Steinberg touches up on this, is like, they don't advertise the hazards early on in the history of these areas. So they got these huge urban booms. So how do you convince these people you're living in this threat area and you really need to prepare for this? This is a message they really don't want to hear.
I think education you can build this into education really early on. The UN ISDR, the disaster reduction, whatever it is. Yes. There's a website, stopdisasters.org, where you can you basically are the mayor of a coastal village, and you have a choice of how to invest scant money in limiting tsunami risk. You can plant mangroves or you can move houses. Each one has different costs, and then the tsunami comes, and you get to kind of experience that. So at the local and state, at the regional level, you can build this kind of learning tools as well. This is not, I think we haven't even touched on the potential for using new media, you can just have animated GIF for those who have teenagers who just live on Reddit. That shows you, the history of Florida, what it looked like before we settled it and not, and then you get an idea.
Or maybe a Vine video.
Yeah, Vine.
Okay, Leslie and then David.
So I wish we had one solution that would check all the boxes, but what we've found in our work, whether it's message or education, that we have to push everything forward. So we are doing scholarships. If you're in school, you're eligible. Meteorology, finance, engineering, risk communication, social psychology, each and every single thing that can impact resilience. There needs to be an appreciation coming out of your degree program. We are doing middle school, we're doing Disney, we're doing elected officials. We have to touch on all the stakeholders, but here's the thing. We have two tracks. We have the right now, what's possible, what's realistic, what's largely incremental, then we have the big idea. So when that big one hits Miami, which has not happened since Andrew, and Andrew PS was not the big one, what's the big bold plan for what Miami will look like after that? This was, I think, done a little bit for New York, and they benefited from that somewhat because they had a leg up before Sandy. But we have to just not limit ourselves and start thinking like through your tax idea. You know, wait a minute, what do you mean it might not be worth as much or it may not have as much land? Just no restrictions. What's the big plan? Will you even build it back? And be prepared to answer that with maybe not. Maybe not, but in the meantime, you make those small steps towards the solution, and we do make progress, but not necessarily in one fell swoop with one idea or one group or one leader. And sometimes it's serendipity. We just get lucky, and we need to be willing to accept that too.
Okay.
And I want to just say something just to complement what Leslie says. We have some really important communities that are in high-risk areas, and those communities have great value. And there's, you know, there's culture, there's history, there's community, right? And even though it's easy to kind of think of it in kind of academic terms and say, you know, why do we have people here? You know, in a way they're there because that there's a history and a culture. I mean, I obviously, you know, I work in New Orleans, right? I mean, you know, there are places where the place itself is so valuable that we will do what it takes to kind of live there, right? And I think it's important for us to realize that resiliency is also, you know, a kind of attitude of adaptation, an attitude of, you know, we can deal with this, right? And so in a sense, there are always going to be communities that are going to be living near the water because that's where their employment is, you know, they want to be there. And so I think part of what we're doing here is not just saying, you know, we're going to solve this problem, because we're not. Part of what we're doing is we're going to, as a culture, continue to have to deal with this problem, adapt to increasing risk, know it's going to cost money to deal with it, but not give up on, you know, the kind of things that we value. So again, I'm a real, you know, firm believer of sort of the part of the goal here is to kind of preserve our culture and our history and our places, realizing that some of them are going to always be, you know, an investment to kind of keep them there. And there's some that we're going to have to go back and keep, you know, kind of cleaning up and going back to, but we'll keep doing it because those are important to us, you know. So again, I think we have to always realize that there's a reason that we live where we do, and some of the places we live certainly have risks with them, but they also have great, you know, benefits, and you know, there's treasures that we don't want to give up in the process. So that's a bit of my, you know, kind of balance with thinking that we can solve this, because we're not going to solve it, we're going to deal with it in a kind of adaptive way, realizing that this is, you know, the work of our time, is figure out how to deal with this.
So sense of place and how you relate to that cultural, natural, political environment is a part of advancing this discussion. You all are part of the cultural elite just by being here at this meeting, and probably the percentages of PhDs. And we're a very rich and diverse country in all senses of the word, but I always remember that our roots are inherently anti-intellectual. The Puritans didn't come here for religious freedom broadly. They only came here for their religious freedom, and as I recall, anyone who disagreed with them tended to be drowned or stoned. And so it wasn't very good for your human condition to disagree with the prevailing views. But Leslie and I were discussing beforehand, as challenging as America is, we were also discussing Bangladesh. And we can remember just 15 years ago when a big storm would hit Bangladesh and people would die in the thousands or the tens of thousands. And they recently had a test of a big storm again. And they had worked very hard over the last decade, top down. So they had built schools and community shelters that were hardened on elevated places. They had purposely elevated it, but they had also empowered, enabled a lot of small village groups to come together and to perform their own kind of community force. And we're talking about a country in which education is not a major factor. So they had a top-down and a bottom-up approach, and the last time they had a humongous storm, we're talking about a death toll that was less than a few hundred in a place where just 15 years before it had been thousands, if not more than that. So if they can do it in Bangladesh, I think we can do it on the Gulf Coast. And if we can do it in the Gulf Coast, we can do it almost any place in this country. Our challenge is that we have not yet imagined that. And so you have a responsibility not only to model and visualize and maybe even imagine, but to recognize that you may be the authoritative source, but you're not the trusted source. So you also have to rely on people like Leslie and Andy and Ellis and Peter and David to be your intermediaries, to be the people who engage even more broadly than you do. But each one of you can actually pick 2 or 3 people that you want to have this discussion with. And I would challenge you to do that before the next AMS meeting. Have that dialogue in your family, in your civic, religious, or community group. Advance the discussion. And with that, thank you for your time, your engagement today. Oh, I'm sorry, Marshall. I thought you were telling me to wrap it up. But if Marshall says we go one more, then please, who are you and what would you like to say?
Yeah, he's leaving.
Did he leave?
No, he's right there.
He's going to go back?
Sorry, no.
The president has
Well, if I
intervened.
have the time, I would like to come with a couple of points. I'm Jesper Teilgaard. I'm chief methodologist at the Danish National TV in Copenhagen. You all know Copenhagen from the 2009 summit. I've been involved in this debate for a long time. It is very important. But to me, there is a big gap between the scientists and the audience. Scientists are always, not always, but very often very bad communicators. Journalists are often good communicators, but they don't often know what they're talking about. Even maybe Andy is a good experience here. But I think that the weather people on TV, which are educated methodologists and also climatologists, know what they're talking about. They can understand the science and they're able to communicate. Therefore, the responsibility of the TV people are very great, and there should be a very big cooperation between the scientists and the TV people, because they have the ability, they have the access to the audience, and they have the visualization. Andy was talking about visualization, and that's very important to people. They do not know equations and so on, but they can look at pictures. Recently, we have a book published in Denmark with pictures from Greenland from 70 years ago, and now photos of glaciers which have melted, pictures from then and now. It is obvious that something is happening. And there we can tell people, you can see it's happening, you have to adapt, and people can understand it. So the TV people are very important in this issue.
Just very quickly, I'll just say that on every campus, virtually every university I've visited has a communications department, psychology department, who know a lot about the science of how people understand information or reject it, and scientists doing interesting work. Too little happens to foster the intersection there. So, and we live in a post-TV world in the sense that YouTube is an open laboratory for everybody. And some of the most popular videos there, as I said, this high school teacher from Montana has become a very influential science educator doing visualizations of basic science concepts. So the playing field is flat now, but what's needed more is crosstalk on campuses. And with that, one of the other missing factors, of course, is in academia. You still don't get advancement toward your goals in academia by being a good communicator, unfortunately.
Well, we honor transdisciplinary and public service in the breach in academia.
Right.
So Thank you for that closing remark, and I really appreciate your taking the time. And for all of you PhDs in meteorology, I want you to learn a new word by the next AMS, psychographics. There's coffee out there, and the concurrent sessions begin at 11. Will you join me in thanking the panel?
Way to go.
Good job.